All right, everyone, just a few more seconds to let the audience come in and we will get started at the top of the hour. All right. Good afternoon and welcome to today's webinar, Streamline IT Procurement, Wisconsin's Interagency Data-Driven Collaborative Approach to Specification Development. This is the third webinar in our Cronin Awards webinar series, and today we'll be taking a closer look at the Gold Award winner for 2021. I want to thank you all for joining us. We're glad you're here. Our 2021 Cronin Awards webinar series continues next month. On Wednesday, December 1st, members of Georgia's Department of Administrative Services will join us to discuss their Small Business Procurement Readiness Workshop. You can learn how Georgia brought together local government, industry, and business development experts to provide a training and networking platform that had an immediate impact. And then on Wednesday, December 8th, learn how Tennessee found a way to use their collected data to motivate bidders to reduce cost proposals. So join us for the webinar, Using Your Leverage, Tennessee's Ordinal Ranking for Negotiations. Registration is open for both webinars. You can visit www.naspo.org to register and look for the webinars tab on the left side of the page. We look forward to seeing you there. At the close of today's presentation, you'll be asked to complete a very brief questionnaire. Your feedback is very valuable to us here at NASPO. Today's presentation is good for 1 contact hour. To get your certificate, simply complete the questionnaire following the presentation. Before we begin, I'd like to take a moment to explain the format of today's webinar. All attendees are muted. You can enter comments and questions in the chat box. If you would like to ask our presenter a question, you can type it into the Q&A box at the bottom of your window. Questions will be addressed throughout the presentation with a period at the end as well. So with that, I'm very pleased to introduce our speaker today. We are honored to have with us Matthew Limoges. He is the Deputy Director of the Wisconsin Bureau of Procurement. His service for the state of Wisconsin began in the Department of Health Services, where he spent 3 years before moving over to DAS in 2018. He was the IT sourcing manager before becoming Deputy Director in 2020, where he has furthered Wisconsin's mission to provide consistent, defendable, equitable, and transparent procurement. NASPO is grateful to have you here with us, so I'll turn it over to you, Matt.
Thank you, Chadwick, and thanks everybody for being here today. We're going to talk through not only kind of our Cronin submission and the efforts that our staff, both past and present, have completed to put us in the position that we are today. But I am also going to start kind of outlining a little of the organizational structure of our procurement function in the state of Wisconsin, as it's important to understand that before we kind of get into our presentation. So I'll continue with the slides. I just wanted to turn my camera on and say hi to everybody, but I'm going to turn my camera off and get right into the meat of the presentation today. And if you can't hear me or anything, please let me know in the chat. We should be all good to go. But okay, so the State Bureau of Procurement in the Division of Enterprise Operations in the Department of Administration, because that name couldn't possibly get longer, right, is the statutorily designated body responsible for all procurement and purchasing within the state of Wisconsin. The person responsible is none other than Cheryl Edgington, the director of the State Bureau of Procurement. She is our chief procurement officer. And the State Bureau of Procurement is made up of 4 distinct sections. All have their own purpose and function for our internal business processes, but The first section is the enterprise sourcing section. The second section is the enterprise IT sourcing section. You can see the difference between those two. We also have our consolidated agency purchasing services section. And finally, our WISPRO resources and special programs section. Okay, so a little outlining of what we refer to as the enterprise, because I'm going to use the term enterprise throughout this presentation to denote kind of the broader scope of the state agencies rather than just the Department of Administration or the Department of, you name it. So when I say enterprise, I mean all state agencies in the state of Wisconsin. And this is just a really quick overview of the different state agencies we have in Wisconsin. But the reason I also wanted to show it on this screen is to show the quantity of agencies that there are, because we, as the State Bureau of Procurement, are allowed to delegate procurement responsibilities to an individual within a state agency. So delegated agencies can conduct their own solicitations with the pre-approval from the State Bureau of Procurement. Non-delegated agencies have their procurement activities conducted by the Consolidated Agency Purchasing Services section. And when individuals are granted delegation, they sign an agreement with the State Bureau of Procurement to follow state procurement rules, use mandatory contracts, etc. So essentially what this does is our statutory responsibility, as well as our ability to delegate the purchasing function to I'm sorry, along with the opportunity to delegate the purchasing function, makes the State Bureau of Procurement have a dual role and responsibility for state procurement. And the first is, regulatory and compliance, right? We have a statutory responsibility to regulate the procurement functions within the delegated agencies. So by that, I mean, we actually have to routinely perform management reviews, or another word for that is audit of agency procurement activities to ensure that they meet the scope and the processes that we kind of outline in our state procurement manual. And then we also have the responsibility to respond to solicitation protest appeals. So when agencies receive protests from vendors are also given a chance to appeal that protest. That protest appeal comes to the Department of Administration, and then our office, along with our legal department and our secretary's office, will respond to that appeal. But I want to show this in this format because I need to show the difference between the regulatory function that we have, as well as the strategic sourcing and contract management function that the State Bureau of Procurement also has. And the big responsibility that we have on this side of the coin is that we establish enterprise contracts for agency use. So back a couple of slides when I showed what the enterprise was, right? I know some states use the term convenience contracts or corporate contracts. That is also a responsibility of the State Bureau of Procurement. And then when we start establishing those enterprise contracts, we need to identify whether or not they will be mandatory or optional in use for agency users. Okay, so when I say enterprise contracts, I mean contracts managed by the State Bureau of Procurement. Typically, and almost always, it's one of the two sections, the enterprise sourcing section or the enterprise IT sourcing section. That makes a lot of sense, right? That manage both the solicitation as well as the resulting contract. So we do some cradle to grave solicitation activities to conduct the procurement, but then we also stay on as the contract manager and administrator for that contract throughout the life of the subsequent contract. So I do put a note in here that the State Bureau of Procurement typically won't manage or establish contracts that have limited use or spend. So for us to kind of establish an enterprise contract, it takes a pretty substantial amount of spend or need from state agencies. We've held contracts with lower spend before as an enterprise contract, but that's more initiative focused. If there's a school safety initiative that we need to jump on, perhaps we'll, establish additional contracts to fulfill that initiative. But typically our enterprise contracts are going to be our big spenders, right? We're going to try to leverage that economies of scale across our corporation, the state of Wisconsin, or what we refer to as the enterprise, to realize any possible efficiencies and savings that we can across the board. We do identify on the front end in the solicitation the intended use of the contract, and that's mandatory or optional. And that's just a signal to the vendors that, hey, if you're going to bid on this contract, you need to know that this is essentially, for lack of a better term, an exclusive contract with the state for all state users on, office supplies, or in this case that we'll talk about later today, computer contracts, right? Or cleaning supplies. So when we say something is mandatory, we take that with a very heavy burden. Because one of the roles and responsibilities of the State Bureau of procurement specialists and subsequent contract managers is that they have to enforce the mandatory nature of those contracts. So agencies do sometimes, from time to time, ask for the ability to purchase off of or to purchase from outside of the mandatory contract. And we used to refer to that as a waiver, but we've now coined it as a business case exception, because when you get a business case exception off of our mandatory contracts, that doesn't give you the right to just go ahead and purchase with that vendor. It just says that, yeah, you're released from the mandatory nature of this contract, but you still have to follow the procurement rules to execute the purchase that you need to complete. So the reason I bring all of this up is because when we're fulfilling both the regulatory as well as the strategic sourcing and contract management function of the State Bureau of Procurement, we try to do so to provide value to our users, right? And part of that is in developing specifications for the original solicitations to set up the resulting contracts. So when we develop a solicitation for enterprise contracts, and I'm saying we because as the State Bureau of Procurement, we typically rely on agency input to develop the specifications for the solicitation. SBOP solicits this input from agencies by establishing what we refer to as either standards or development committees. And these committees are responsible not only for establishing the specifications for the enterprise contract based on their agency needs, but also depending on the solicitation type, these committees may be responsible for developing the solicitation scoring structure, strategy, et cetera. So we typically try to outline agency needs on the front end with the agencies. We're not just cutting or writing with a red pen over everything that the State Bureau of Procurement says you're going to buy blue widgets when maybe agencies need red or yellow widgets. We want to get that input from our agencies, and the way that we do that is through our agency special designated agents or delegated agents that we kind of highlighted at the front of this process. So it is, the regulatory and strategic sourcing and contract management function interplay way too closely at times throughout this process, but it's allowed us to really create this room for collaborative efforts with agencies, both throughout the administration of the contract as well as the development of the solicitation. So after the solicitation results in an enterprise contract, the State Bureau of procurement specialists manager and administer that resulting contract. So typically our responsibilities are that we enforce the mandatory nature of the contracts, right? If we find that an agency is purchasing office supplies not off of our office supply contract, we may ask questions of that agency. Hey, is there a reason you're not purchasing off of our mandatory contract? Sometimes it's that agencies weren't aware that we had a mandatory contract, right? So education is a big component of the role of the contract manager and administrator for us. Also, facilitating the resolution of contractual disputes between agencies and suppliers. This happens more often than I'd like to admit, that there seems to be an impasse between an agency and a supplier on some sort of order fulfillment or some sort of contractual services relationship that they aren't really seeing eye to eye. Well, then we as the contract managers, administrators, have to step in and try to assist in the facilitation of the resolution of those disputes. We also review and monitor usage and spend reports. So this is going to be one of the big takeaways for today is that we use those usage and spend reports to try to paint a story, right? If our contracts, if we're seeing a lack of spend on contracts, perhaps we're asking around, why are you not in a cycle where you need to use this contract? We let the data drive our decision-making process on the contracts across the board typically. The procurement specialists also are going to amend contracts for agency needs and also ensure supplier contractual responsibilities are being met. So reporting, different type of responsibilities on the contract. That's one of the roles of our procurement specialists as well. I'm gonna take a sip of something here. All right, so the section that completed the effort that we're going to finally at some point talk about today, I promise, was the enterprise IT sourcing section. And that's the section in the statement of procurement that's responsible for establishing enterprise contracts for all IT related commodities and services. This section collaborates with our division of enterprise technology and IT contractual matters. So DET in DOA provides enterprise technology services for agency use. So DET is the ones that control the data center, any mainframe operations. That enterprise level technology services, that's what DET is providing to the agencies. And the reason I need to highlight that is because almost every state agency actually has their own IT director. So I think our most recent CIO always used to say, imagine having a board of directors with 30 people on it, all with different points of view. That's kind of the environment that our enterprise IT sourcing section finds themselves in sometimes, is they have to balance the input both from the enterprise technology standards maker, as well as the 30 different IT directors who want what they want for their agency, without really overly being concerned about what other agencies are doing. They're looking out for their agency, that's their responsibility. So this section must ensure that their contracts meet the enterprise technical standards set by DET, but they also must ensure that their contract meets the needs of all of the agency IT directors, right? So it's meeting needs, it's not meeting wants, which is something that we're going to kind of get into a little later today. But I highlight all of this to just try to set the stage for what we're going to talk through the rest of this presentation today, in acknowledging the different factors at play, the different IT directors, the different agency procurement directors, right? The different forces that were all employed during this process. And I hope that kind of gives you the scope and context to hopefully understand this process a little better about what we did. And so what we did was, the contract in question was the computer contract. So the computer contract is a fancy computer number here, 505 ENT enterprise contract. See what we did there. M17 is mandatory, Wisconsin computer, just a pretty quick description of computer equipment and related services. This resulted from a request for bid, and it's a mandatory contract. It is a multiple supplier contract. We had an initial 3-year contract term with 1 2-year renewal possible on this contract. So let's start at the very beginning, because Julie Andrews once told me that was a very good place to start. The request for bid. So the award was based on the lowest bidders for each nationally recognized manufacturer for this request for bid. The bid was a combined cost of the manufacturer's models that met the standard configurations that were developed as a part of the development committee. So that's a lot of words. What does that mean? So for example, we had multiple different categories in this bid. Those were the desktop value model, the desktop standard model, the workstation performance model, the portable standard model, the portable performance model, and the portable workstation use model. And so what we did was we established standard configurations for every single model, right? So for the desktop standard, we offer, a classic configuration or specification for that computer model would be, must operate Windows 10, has to have an Intel processor of Core i5 3.1 gigahertz at a minimum, have to have at least 8 gigabytes of RAM installed with 3 open RAM expansion slots, with a hard drive of at least 500 gigabytes, either a standard hard drive disk or a solid state drive. So when we're talking standard configurations throughout the life of this presentation, when we're talking, these are the configurations that we looked for, right? We told the vendors, hey, we need models. Oh, thank you, Bradley, for saying the Montana set up exactly the same way in terms of organizational structure. That's helpful, because I just want to make sure that everybody's aware of our organizational structure when I start talking enterprise contracts, etc. So I appreciate that feedback. When we're talking standard configurations, it's these specific components that we're outlining that will become a pretty significant portion of the rest of the discussion today. So vendors responded with their price of their models that met those configurations for those different categories, right? Here's the desktop value model. I don't even know what the model names were, but here's the model name for HP. Here's it for Lenovo. And then we awarded multiple bidders on the HP resellers, the Lenovo resellers, the Dell resellers, et cetera, et cetera. But this bid also required bidders to provide their entire catalog discounts as informational pricing. So when we refer to something as informational pricing in the State Bureau of Procurement, we're referring to that as something that's not being added in the context for the method of the award, but it is being requested of the vendors to hold those vendors contractually to it throughout the life of the contract. So for this perspective, we asked for a discount off lists of both the entire catalog discounts as well as the discount of off list of the models that they outlined that met all of these standard configurations. So the discount off list price that the state could expect on custom configurations for this entire catalog discount is if an agency had a need for a computer that was maybe a little more souped up than our desktop standard. Maybe they needed a desktop performance model that had even better specs than the specs that we outlined in the bid. We do offer the opportunity for agencies to reach out to the resellers and say, hey, I need a desktop that has 128 gigabytes of RAM. And I don't even, the fastest processor, that you can get into that model. That custom configuration pricing is what I'm going to refer to as throughout the life of this presentation as custom configurations. In addition to requiring the catalog, how are you able to only require pricing from nationally recognized manufacturers? So what we said is that we needed a manufacturer to fulfill every one of these categories, right? So we needed a manufacturer that had that could provide a model for desktop value, desktop standard, workstation performance, portable standard, portable performance, portable workstation use. And so if there was a manufacturer in there that could provide all of those models, that's kind of what we refer to as nationally recognized manufacturers. So there was more to the bid. I'm not trying to get into, the T's and C's of every portion of the bid. I appreciate the question, Brenda, but it was, more aimed towards manufacturers that could provide models across all categories versus just one or two from here, because we wanted the full slate of pricing available for every manufacturer. Okay, so we asked for that pricing on those categories. We also asked for their entire catalog discounts, which allowed agencies later on in the contract to receive custom configuration pricing from the resellers. We also required bidders to provide pricing for any value-add services that they could offer on the resulting contract. So some of these could be, imaging the machines, warehousing of units if they could do that, kind of any services that they thought the state may find value in, and then we had the opportunity to either accept or reject those portions of the bidder's response. Okay, so the RFP manager had the foresight to include the following language in the bid, which is going to be really important later. But that's that during the contract renewal period, the state may refresh minimum standard configurations, discount categories, and value-add services to reflect updated business needs. State reserves the right to add or delete products and or services and to expand or decrease the standard configurations over the life of the contract. So this statement essentially led us to have the opportunity to conduct the analysis and process that we did. So when we talk back about the ability to refresh the standard configurations, we point back to this language that we included into the solicitations. The first takeaway from this presentation should be that if you are in a situation in which kind of mimics our computer contract, where you may have to update specifications throughout the life of the contract, it may be beneficial for you to put this information in so that you have the flexibility to do what we did throughout the rest of the contract. Okay, so the difference between custom and standard configurations on the bid was standard configurations they were the most heavily discounted. So those 7 categories or whatever I laid out earlier range from anywhere from 52% to 64% off of the list price provided by the manufacturers. And that's the reason that is because the award is based on those categories. However, one of the detriments of the standard configurations is that those standard configurations were set in stone with the certain components that we outlined in the standard configurations, right? We can't go to the vendor and say, hey, can you match? We could try to go and say, hey, could you match that 64% discount off list that you gave to me for that performance desktop, and maybe provide me a little updated processor. We could ask our agencies to work with our suppliers like that, but absent anything contractually, they wouldn't be held to the same standards that they were for the held to the same conditions and payment terms that they were for the standard configurations. The custom configurations on the contracts were less discounted based on the informational pricing that we talked about a little bit earlier, provided by those suppliers. So that average range was from 19% to 40% off of list price, depending on the manufacturer that bid. So one manufacturer said, everything outside of our standard configurations, you're going to get 22% off list, right? This information is going to become important as a reference point as we get further into today's presentation. But the custom configurations do provide greater flexibility for users to customize their tools, right? If they have a need for increased RAM and they don't want to put the RAM in themselves, or they don't have the people to put the RAM in themselves, perhaps this is a situation in which they need to order that with those components on the front end. So this led to the problem, right? Upon reviewing spend and usage reports, we determined in fiscal year 2019, less than 1% of all computers purchased by the state of Wisconsin utilized those standard configurations. So that meant that we weren't receiving the maximum discount that the contract called for. So when I used the term throughout the rest of this presentation, the standard configuration utilization rate, the calculation for that is the percentage of the computers that were purchased off of the contract that were actually named standard configurations on the front end of the process. So we knew that we had an issue here, right? We know that less than 1% of our customers or our users are actually purchasing the standard configurations that we took the time to set up through a solicitation, through the specification development process, right? And I think as procurement professionals, our initial response in this type of situation is to pull spend reports, communicate to agency movers that they're leaving significant discounts on the table, to come out of this from more of a compliance perspective, right? Why are you not using the standard configurations? Have you provided adequate justification for using custom configurations? You may want to establish additional controls over the use of the contract to try to force those agencies to use the standard configurations on the contract. So we started to ask the question, what was the problem here? We knew the problem was that we were leaving significant discounts on the table, but we didn't know why. We didn't know whether or not agencies were always going to have their different configurations that they were going to use. So perhaps this was going to be a fruitless effort. But the question that we wanted to ask ourselves was, did we have a user problem or did we have a contract problem? So I'm going to go on a tangent here for a second, but I hope you'll see kind of where I'm bringing this back to. There's a concept in urban planning called desire lines or desire paths. So these are paths that branch off from designated paths to provide a more efficient approach to the user's destination. So think about it. You're walking down a sidewalk, you get to a big field. A college quad is a good example where perhaps there's a box, a rectangle around a quadrangle. that's the paths there, and then you see all this trampled down grass in between it, where people are trying to cut the paths to get to where they need to get to earlier. So here's some depictions of different desire lines. So you see here, these people know they can either go down here and turn right, or they can just follow this user provided path to get to where they need to get faster. Here you see multiple desire lines to get to the same position down here, rather than following the designated paths. But in the concept of urban planning, you have the decision to either force people down the paths using this fenced approach, right? You're going to use these paths because we've designated them as paths, or you can follow the approach on the right, which is, hey, you had that little, that user, that desire path established. What if I just paved that, right? What if I didn't fight this anymore and made this work for you, rather than trying to make you work in the paths? So the reason I bring that depiction and that kind of description to light here is because when we started looking into this, it became clear that we had an issue with our contract and not user adherence to the terms and conditions of that contract. So we knew that we wanted to ensure the maximum amount of savings available on the contract were realized by our users. And in order to fix the contract, we had to understand what the agency needs were. So I'm going to pause here for a second, see if there's any questions while I take a sip of something. Okay, so we've done all of this analysis to identify, hey, we have significant savings or cost reduction out there that we're not achieving right now. But we're also in the middle of this contract. Well, let's refer back to the original bid, in which we said, hey, we actually have an opportunity to refresh these standard configurations. We had a bunch of questions about this process, but what we needed to do initially was to develop a standards committee during the life of the contract based on usage and spend reports. So our contract manager pulled usage and spend reports both out of our ERP system as well as a vendor spend report to highlight not only what was being purchased when, but down to the model level, including configurations of those models to determine who was purchasing what. Right? Did we have a specific model at DNR that they were, our Department of Natural Resources, that they were purchasing? Or was this a situation in which, perhaps agencies weren't even doing these big mass orders of these things? Maybe they were just doing these one-offs. So we had all of these questions to kind of figure out, because I think we all come at it from different perspectives when we talk through these things. I think my initial response would be, oh, like I said initially, agencies aren't following the direction. Let's get them back on track. But I applaud the efforts of the contract manager to pull the data to really outline what was going on. And once we pulled the data, we actually reached out to the agencies with the heaviest use on the contract and asked them to volunteer representatives for developing and refreshing the standard configurations during the life of the contract. So standard configurations were to be developed by the users and not our typical top-down bureaucratic approach to standards. So I think sometimes, especially as it relates to technical standards, we can just take input from one individual, whether that be our chief information officer or perhaps our chief business officer or whomever, what chief officer or whoever's in a decision-making position in your agency, to say, yes, we need this many gigabytes of RAM, blah, 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 blah. We as procurement professionals, maybe we just kind of jump on board with that because that's our job, right? You tell me what you need, I accept that and I put it out on the street and we kind of see what we get back. When we saw that the contract problem wasn't based on the lack of decisiveness about the original specifications. I think it was one of the contract issues was that we hadn't refreshed the specifications throughout the initial term of the contract, that 3 years, which in a computer world that's a decade, right? As it relates to different technology. I once had a reseller tell me, hey, curved monitors are becoming standard in private industry. I said, oh, great. Do you want to, add those to the contract? He goes, no, I actually think that it'll probably be 6 or 7 years before you add them to your contract, right? That's just how far we are behind in state government. And maybe that's not true for all state governments, but I think we typically squeeze all the life out of our tools that we can, probably even more than private industry. And so the reason I say that is because it may be, you may be still on 19-inch box monitors, but that doesn't mean that your contract needs to be restricted to those, dated specifications. And if those specifications are coming top down, you're never going to have the buy-in from the users that you need. I do have to shout out, thanks to the flexibility of our enterprise IT department, we had the opportunity to work with agencies to name standards. This was not a situation in which our enterprise technology department was interested in saying, no, it has to be this amount of RAM, it has to be this. We had a couple requirements for our enterprise technology group, but it was pretty limited, they weren't component specific configuration requirements. They were more kind of service delivery requirements as it related to kind of some security concerns. So, okay, I'm going to go over a couple slides of hurdles that we had with this refresh, and then I'll talk through the result and what we kind of got to. But with over 25 state agencies, again, I think we're over 30, who all have their own IT directors, we knew consensus was an impossibility, right? So as we were working through this committee, we knew that we weren't looking to establish a standard configuration that everybody was going to buy into. We thought that if we could explain the economic benefits of purchasing the standard configuration versus a custom configuration, that some agencies would lean towards adopting the standard. Okay. I'll get into what our goal was, I think, in the next couple slides. But again, I want everybody to know we did not set out this effort with the thought process that we're going to name a new standard and every computer purchased off of the contract is going to fall into this standard bucket. We knew that we were never going to get to a situation in which every state agency agreed with our configurations because they all have different needs, right? A lot of our state agencies are mobile, I guess we're all a little mobile now, but a lot of our state agencies, maybe they have a need for, a workspace that is, mounted in a car. So is there different components for that you need than a workspace that, doesn't leave someone's cubicle? So we knew that we were never going to get to consensus, but we knew if we took kind of an economic approach with describing the significant savings that they could achieve by serving the standard, that perhaps we would increase that standard utilization rate. But in order for this to work, we had to ensure that the standard configuration was useful, which they obviously weren't based on the utilization rate in fiscal year 19. And I must say, I'm not saying that the standard configurations were never useful. I just think that, because of the time period that we didn't refresh the standard configs, it was a situation in which they became less useful as the contract, timeline moved out. One of the bigger issues was vendor buy-in, right? Why would vendors ever come back to us and say, sure, we'll give you more computer for less money, right? But that's exactly what we needed to go back to. So when Chadwick kind of introduced this process, I think he, leaned on some of our buzzwords here in the state of Wisconsin, which included, consistent, equitable, transparent, and fair solicitations. And if we were in a situation in which we were to upgrade the standard configurations that were previously discounted at 54 to 64%, but then didn't require the vendors to upgrade their standard configs back down to that level, then perhaps this is a situation in which, we would be changing the original scope of the contract and it wouldn't actually be a fair solicitation on the front end. So what we wanted to do is that we wanted to require that the new standard configurations remain within the existing discount price off of list. So that meant the list price obviously was going to go up, right? If I was requiring 8 gigabytes of RAM in the existing standard configuration, now I'm requiring 16. Obviously, we understand that there's an additional price to that. But it was well within the terms of the original solicitation to say, hey, that list price can go up. In fact, I think, we had a process built that manufacturers could submit to us their manufacturer price list so that we could verify the discount off list, which did change based on a quarterly or semi-annually base or biannual basis, whatever that may be. So what we told the vendors is, hey, we know that what we need is going to be a little more expensive. And we were able to show them the data that we had from the original the data collection effort to say, look, we're buying this model in great quantities, but it's not named as our standard configuration. So you're giving us 22% off list on that rather than the 54 to 64%. We also wanted to consult with the vendors to identify what configs of the components were possible. I know it sounds silly to think that perhaps why wouldn't AMD be able to offer a certain style of RAM for a Dell endpoint, but that is a very real issue that we ran into, is that perhaps Dell doesn't offer an AMD processor or an AMD video card as it relates to a certain and having that certain amount of RAM, right? So we were trying to increase the level of the specifications that we had to drive better usage on the contract, but we wanted to make sure that those specifications were possible. And again, because the original RFB identified this possibility, vendors were aware that we were able to do this contractually. So I wrote in here other vendor benefits because I didn't want to put anything in writing, but I know a couple of other resellers appreciated this because then they didn't have to continue to go back out and find the antiquated models that we were looking for, right? If it had been 3 years since we had updated or refreshed the standard configurations, then perhaps there were supply chain issues for them to find the aging models for ourselves throughout the life of it. The other piece is as the technology became better and our specifications became better, this became much easier for our suppliers to fulfill orders. They knew that, okay, they're no longer looking for those back standard configurations. We know that, perhaps we're not going to have to custom quote every single order from agencies. So I think the other vendor benefits that they achieved through this process kind of outweighed any cost that they would have on their side. And again, I can't stress this enough. It's not like we were going to be, getting a better computer at a lower price than the existing standard configuration. We knew that we were going to get a better computer. We just wanted to match that discount off list for the standard configurations versus the custom configurations. Okay, so we've gone through the hurdles that we had with developing the specifications. We've talked through the vendor buy-in, but as it relates to everything that you do in a state government context, now what is the agency buy-in, right? You go through this entire effort and then maybe agencies go, oh, that's cool, but I'm never going to do that, right? Because you cannot include every agency in the decision-making process when you're developing these specifications. So we knew that regardless of updating the configurations of the components, we knew some agencies would continue to want what they wanted. So an example of this is our own division or our own department did not adopt the standard configurations that we adopted as the enterprise standard configuration on the contract. But we had a different responsibility for the enterprise than our IT department did in our agency. So that is actually a rub that we kind of took straight on, is, hey, if this standard config is not even going to work for our department, let's make sure that it works for the most departments out there available. So we knew that was going to be a situation, but we had hoped with greater education amongst the agency procurement offices that we were hoping for higher standard configurations utilization rates. So we had set a goal of achieving like a 50% standard configuration utilization rate on this contract. Again, we were at less than 1%, prior to updating the standard configurations. Even after we reviewed the data, we didn't know that we were going to be able to, we honestly didn't know whether or not we were going to be able to get to the 50% standard configuration utilization rate. But I think we kind of blew that out of the water for a couple of reasons, which I'll talk to in a bit. But the result of our effort was that the state of Wisconsin was able to buy better computers at a lower price and on a quicker timetable. So suppliers back then, when we were still having the chip shortages coming out of China way pre-COVID, right? We were able to, they were able to perhaps, order massive quantities of standard configs, get them onshore, and then distributing them to the agencies that they needed. But we did achieve our goal in that we were able to buy better computers at a lower price and on a quicker timetable. Now, to quantify that, in fiscal year 2019, 0.9 of computers purchased off of the contract with the standard configuration that was priced with that deepest discount. In fiscal year 2020, that number shot up to 49.1% of the computers purchased off the contract were the standard configuration that was priced with the deepest discount. In fiscal year 2021, 73.5% of computers purchased off of the contract were the standard configuration that was priced with the deepest discount. So you can just, I mean, this is elementary level pie graph stuff, but you can see just the progression towards achieving standard configuration utilization on our contract. You go from this little tiny sliver to roughly half to almost 3/4 of the computers being purchased off the contract. So again, we achieved the goal, and frankly, if we got to 50, we were going to be over the moon excited. When our contract manager pulled the data and she told me that we got to 73.5% in 2021, we had to rerun that probably 3 or 4 times to really identify how and why we got there. So we're going to talk through that in a little bit too, but I also wanted to quantify it in the significant cost reduction component. So recall that the standard configuration discounts were anywhere from 52% to 64% off of list price, depending on the manufacturer, and that those custom configuration discounts were anywhere from 19% to 40% off of list price, depending on the manufacturer. So when we calculated the cost reduction, what we did is we identified the models that were purchased in fiscal year 20 and 21. We were able to calculate the difference in the discount rate for the new standards that were purchased, whereas though before those models were named standards, they would have been priced as custom configurations. So essentially, we were able to calculate for the models that of the 73.5% or the 49.1% of those standard configurations that we purchased, we were able to identify the delta between the custom configuration and the standard configuration and quantify that to the tune of, in fiscal year 2020, we reduced computer costs by $5,299,791.28. And in fiscal year 2021, in the first 3 quarters alone, we were able to reduce computer costs by $3,547,311.47. So very significant cost reduction. So you see, I'm not using the word savings, right? Because I think the word savings can be misrepresented at times. But in this situation, when I'm saying the word cost reduction, we were able to directly tie the delta between the custom configuration and the standard configuration to the effort that we did in updating those standard configurations. So again, a nice little elementary school bar graph for you there. But more importantly, what did we learn? The number one lesson that we learned was always pull the contract usage data to best identify what the problem is. What are you facing with the contract? Are the users not acting within the terms of the contract, or are the terms of the contract not working for the users, right? I cannot impress upon this group enough that ask the question as to whether or not that, is your government working for you, or are you working for your government, right? What are we doing that is possibly affecting users on the contract that we can change? If the contract's not using, let's change it. We also learned that, surprise, surprise, economic incentives work better than compliance actions. Agencies don't like to be threatened that their unmandatory use of our contract could result in an unauthorized purchase memo. However, if we say, hey, you can save $600 per endpoint by just purchasing this computer, those efforts proved much more fruitful than the compliance actions. I think it's because we highlighted the cost reduction agencies would realize. This moved agencies to purchase that standard configurations at a greater rate, but I think there's other issues or other global factors that we'll talk about in a couple slides. The third thing that we learned is that consensus is impossible to meet all needs, right? We are in a situation with all of us on this call have 1,000 different customers. Our boss is a customer, right? Our boss's boss is a customer. Our customer is our customer. But we learned that a utilitarian approach using the data on the contract. So we could always point back to the data to say, listen, we have multiple agencies buying the EliteBook 840 from HP. Perhaps we should name that as the model and then work with our suppliers to do that rather than just asking the agencies, hey, what do you think the model should be, right? If you let the data drive the conversations and the collaboration effort, we found that to be much more effective on the back end. And finally, the last thing we highlighted was that, or we learned was that strong contract and procurement management matters, right? Absent the efforts of both the contract and the procurement manager, these results would not have been possible. Had the procurement manager not put in the original solicitation the opportunity to refresh our specifications, we wouldn't be in a situation in which we were able to, see such cost reduction year over year, right? And the contract manager didn't look deeper into the data to really highlight what the issue was. Perhaps our initial approach would have been, hey, let's make sure that we're all purchasing standard configurations. But we actually, because we were able to highlight that relatively early on in the process, a note that I want to talk about is, we might have caught lightning in a bottle with this effort because we completed our refresh and contractual amendments literally right before the pandemic changed our world. So that a couple things on that. Is as agencies needed to send people in their work environments home with mobile workstations where they maybe didn't have those mobile workstations before. Perhaps that's one of the reasons that they were just placing mass orders with our vendors. Absolutely would be ignorant of me to state that COVID-19 didn't have anything to do with our success here. But I don't want to downgrade the level of work that went into this because we put ourselves in a position, we didn't know the pandemic was going to change anything, but we put ourselves in a position to allow for the greater flexibility on the use of that contract. The other piece that I don't know, that we don't have any data on is the refresh cycle of our agency IT departments. We may have caught a significant refresh cycle on our endpoints. So, some agencies have a 4-year refresh cycle that they order a new endpoint. Some agencies have a 5-year refresh cycle. I don't know if there's, if multiple agencies have, massive orders. That was one piece that we were never able to piece together using the data as to whether or not that's another reason that we had a pretty significant uptick in the use of the standard configurations. And then finally, I think that, like I mentioned before, the curved laptops being standard for state in about 6 or 7 years, I know, in my own personal experience, we had a pretty significant changeover from desktop-based endpoint to laptop-based endpoint, to which that may have inflated our standard utilization rate a little as well. So just wanted to make those notes to let everybody know that, we acknowledge that, absent any other situation, perhaps we're not in the position that we are. But again, thanks to the efforts from both, our contract management, our agency users, and our procurement manager for, first including that information in the solicitation, we were able to refresh these specifications and see the cost reductions that we were hoping to, and increase our standard configuration utilization rate well past our goal. So with that, I know I just talked a pretty long time, but I wanted to see if there were absolutely any questions about anything that I talked about today.
So first, let's start with how does the cost savings accounting work?
Yeah, so great question. So like I said, throughout the process is that we took the delta between the custom configuration discount rate and the standard configuration discount rate and applied that to the standard configuration models that were purchased in fiscal years 20 and 2021 to get to that cost reduction number. So I just want to be really transparent about how we got there. And again, we're not claiming that as savings because I think that that's a whole nother conversation that we're not really interested in having at this point.
So what would you say is some of the biggest challenges to the development and implementation of this? Maybe some unforeseen, like what were the biggest hurdles in getting agencies on board?
So yeah, so I think the biggest hurdle always that we tend to kind of gloss over at times as enterprise contract managers is getting agencies on board, right? I refer to it as making that internal sell. You have to actually sell your customers why this is beneficial for them, right? And so we were actually able to, use that data that we had originally pulled through the contract to show them, if you had used the standard configurations in this past year, perhaps this is what you would have saved. So I think the biggest component, just with my experience in state government in general, is just the education of your users. I refer to it as the rule of threes. And I know for the people in Wisconsin who are on this call, I know you've heard this about 100 times, but I think that sometimes you got to tell people 3 times something to make it register. The first time you tell it to them, they're like, oh, that doesn't really matter to me. The second time you tell it to them, they think, oh, that matters to me, but I'm not going to really listen to you at this point. And the third time you tell somebody something, they become really indignant and, the accusing you that you've never let them know about this issue before. So I think the continued education efforts of what we're trying to do on our contracts to make them work for our users is, most often the biggest hurdle that we come across. And I think that it's also the biggest one that we kind of overlook at times. I think we kind of think that if we put the puzzles pieces in place, we'll get to where we need to be. But we always have to never, forget that internal sell that we got to make.
Excellent. So for some of our members who may be thinking about or coming up on an opportunity to implement some new standard configurations or to try to switch over to a similar initiative, what would be some steps or strategies that you would give them to get started?
Great question. So I think the number one thing is that if you are in a situation where you're trying to bid out a computer-based contract with standard configurations, that you offer yourself the greatest flexibility to refresh the standard configurations, even on a 6-month basis. Stuff's moving so quick right now. Processors are becoming short based on different manufacturers, right? If you had the opportunity to refresh those on a routine basis, it doesn't have to be an overly onerous effort to go into refreshing those specifications. But if you had the opportunity and flexibility to do that at a much more rapid pace, I think that you would achieve the things that you'd like that we achieved in that initial 2-year period after we refreshed those standard configs.
All right. If there are no other questions, then all right, that concludes today's presentation. I want to thank our presenter, Matthew Limoges, for the valuable information he shared today, for working with us here at NASPO to bring it to you. Thank you all for attending this webinar today. You'll all receive a follow-up email containing today's slides. Remember, this webinar qualifies as 1 contact hour for your continuing education. To receive your certificate, simply fill out the survey in your browser window once you've exited the webinar. This webinar has been recorded and will be available for viewing on the NASPO YouTube page in the coming days. Any questions entered into the chat and Q&A boxes have been saved, and we'll try to follow up via email for any ones not addressed during the presentation. Thanks again to our wonderful presenter, and thank you to our guest. Everyone, have a great day.